Today, I want to tell you about a newsletter business that you've probably never heard of, but it's also probably the only financial newsletter that is subscribed to by the boards and management teams of most Fortune 100 and 500 companies. Um, it's a very unique publishing business, and I learned about it back from my friend Raul Paul, who's co-founded Real Vision. Raul, before founding Real Vision, he was the co-hedge fund of sales for Goldman Sachs in Europe. He ran his own institutional, I would say, research newsletter, right? It was like $40,000 a year to subscribe. And his kind of big claim to fame at that point when we were working together was that he had helped Kyle Bass really cash in for his clients on the predicting the housing bust. But when Raul asked me to come help him on Real Vision, one of the areas that he really had me focus on was their publishing business, which they called Think Tank at the time. And inside there, and I'm not going to talk about the business model of that, but what was fascinating was that, so Raul had his, Macro Insider, which is a $40,000 a year newsletter for, hedge funds and things like that. And I had a few dozen guys inside Think Tank, most of whom also had services and research publications that were very similar priced, right? They're all institutional services, 10, 20, 30, $50,000, some more. And their clients were all institutional. Now, in that world, one man was king. This was the guy that I know Raul was just like, he's built the best business. He's the only one who really crossed over with macro research from publishing to, the Kyle Basses of the world, the hedge fund kind of world, the investor world, and made the crossover to the business world. And that's what was so amazing, was that his business was so much bigger than everybody else's because he was able to open up a new market. And it was the same types of information, just presented in a different way. And he was able to, like I said, get into the boardrooms, right, of most major Fortune 100, 500 companies, or at least a lot of them, right? And so the company I'm talking about is a company called 13D, and it's run by a guy named Kiril Sokolov. And what's really interesting about this, from just a business standpoint, from a publisher standpoint, is that you would recognize, and I'll show you their sites. I'm going to put some links below this video. I'll link to a bunch of things for you that we'll talk about. But what's really interesting from a publishing standpoint is you're going to recognize most of the elements of what they're doing, right? So it is a guru business, hands down. It's a guru business, right? This is about Kiril Sokolov. It's about Kiril's ability to predict big trends. It's about his ability to forecast what's happening, and translate that into an understandable ideas or understandable language and concepts for business leaders, right? For CEOs and management teams, as well as for the fund side, right? From the investing side. So he'll take something like interest rates and changes in the currency markets and break that down, how it's going to play out within particular sectors and issues in the global economy from a business leader's perspective, right? And because of that, he's built this very, very robust, it's very niche business, right? But as a publishing business, and I don't know their exact revenues, I've heard all kinds of numbers. I would estimate it's probably in like the $25 to $35 million range, which is not like a huge publisher, but it's an extraordinarily stable business. And more importantly, I think it's an example of how so much of what we do in our franchises is translatable into other markets or ancillary markets, right? One market over, right? So here you have somebody who has a macro research newsletter. He doesn't even have to make stock picks, right? Because that's not his market. His market is not like the retail guy. His market is, what are the trends that are happening, and how is this going to impact different segments of industry? And that's extraordinarily valuable information. It's also a lot more forgiving in a lot of ways, because nobody's going back and saying, oh, your portfolio sucked, right? But again, so let me run through what they have here. So I'm gonna share my screen real quick and just show you the website, and I'll link to this and few other things. All right. So this is 13D, right? Market foresights for investors and leaders, right? Market forecasts, that's primarily what they do. He's got a ton of testimonials, just like you would do. They publish twice a week, right? And they start at $20,000. But they have a sales force, right? So they do a lot of podcasts. They go on Real Vision, they go on other places, and they publish research at twice a week, $20,000 a year. And then they have this menu. Their back end is really interesting, right? Because what their back end in is like six-figure consulting. And so they'll have this whole range of things besides the publication. So the $20,000 is the front end, which, this speaks to the difference between a B2B business and a B2C business. I've been, people know, if they've been talking to me at the bar, FMS, for years, know that I'll often bring up the differential in the math of the business in a direct response for a direct to consumer business versus a direct to business business. Because if you think about like direct response, you're basically going to advertise. In order to scale, you're going to advertise and spend a lot of money on the front end to acquire a huge amount of customers, right? Because you have this massive audience of people that you have to select down into prospects, that you need to select down into people who will buy up your product ladder. In the B2B world, or because of that math, right, of having a huge volume of people on the front, in a relatively low lifetime value, right? Your lifetime values, even in the best cases, right? Like when Porter Stansberry was at FMS, he was talking about their lifetime values. You're looking in the several $1,000s range on a retail basis. In this world, like $20,000 is your minimum customer value for these guys. And so their lifetime values are way higher. Plus, because you have, on a relative basis, a much smaller universe of potential customers, you basically have lower advertising costs and way more upside per customer. So you can spend a lot more money, right, to get a customer. And in this case, they're going to a sales floor or sales team. But their product ladder, then think about that. They have some free content. Then they have essentially $20,000 service, and they have a sales team. So that there's wiggle room in that. And they say if you listen to their pitch, they cover research all over the place, and then they will customize what would be perfect for you, and then give you a price based on that. But it's usually around $20,000. So they have front end, they have back end, they have a guru business. They have what I think Brian Hunt in his at this point, at least for me, kind of epic article on what makes a great newsletter editor. They have a bunch of unique UEPs, unique editorial positioning. In their case, they have a research group. They have analysts all over the world globally. They're plugged in everywhere, and so their analysts on the ground in different industries and sectors are writing for them, and that kind of goes into what this is what I learned this week. I'll see if I can find some samples of this newsletter to send around. I'm not sure if I still have them. I used to have some really good ones, and I don't think it'd be a problem because they're so out of date that it wouldn't be an issue to show kind of some of that. But it's really fascinating stuff, but it's not like mind-blowing. Now, if you go down to what themes they cover, right, this is very classic, very, very classic investor, not trader, investor focused kind of stuff, right? They're talking about 5G is their first thing listed, right? Which was how many people had a 5G promo for how long, right? So they have all these different sectors that they cover. And so they dive into these different sectors and regions, and they do it from a commodity or from a macro theme perspective. And then you'll see they'll have a ton of testimonials and things like that. So for me, this business is really interesting because it's a similar franchise model that we have. It's sold on a lot of the same things. There's a track record, right? Kiril's 38-year track record of things that he has recommended. And this is essentially this is a very classic newsletter approach, right? It's basically, here's all the big calls that he got correct. Now, of course, when we get into forecasting issues, is there a question of typicality in the forecast? How many other forecasts were made? But the thing is it's the same thing in every way from how you would structure so much of your business, right? With the difference being that their target market is you know, the corporate world. And so that means that the credibility has to be adjusted, right? Like, you know how it is. If you have credibility with, you know, the credibility you need to sell to a college student coming out of college who's interested in this stuff versus like somebody who has a lot more experience in financial markets as a retail investor versus selling to a hedge fund versus selling to, like, you know, the Elon Musks of the world. Like, you could be given the same information, right? But you would need to have a higher and higher level of credibility in order to do that, right? And so there's a track record, and there's the performance, and there's the promise, but there's like this level of credibility. And so Kiril has done a great job of having this phenomenal credibility. He's built it up over decades. And so I wanted you to look at this, not because it's something that I suggest that you actually try and imitate, because you can't. The idea is not to imitate other people's businesses. It's the idea is to look at the different ways that the structural components of what we call a publishing business, right? You have a media team, you have an editor or a guru, you have a marketing team, you have a kind of content and products, and you have target markets. But these are guru info marketing businesses, right? And here is a guru-based info marketing business that's selling to the top layer of corporate America, much like a management consulting firm would, right? A Bain or a BCG or a McKinsey. But he's doing it with essentially a newsletter. And then their back end is, hey, let's help you understand these trends in relation to your business by taking our analysts and getting these six-figure kind of consulting packages. And so way higher level of credibility. You can see here, like, he's been going since 1983, right? And because of that, like, he was writing at a time when there wasn't a lot of people writing, and he's really phenomenal. Like, if you talk to any of the institutional people, like I said, the people who are in the institutional research industry that I got, like I did, all these guys are like, you know, they're reading and they want to know what Kiril says, right? Because everything that they do, they might take some, they might not follow exactly what he's saying, but like, it's kind of like he is the epitome, he's the apex of the institutional research segment of the world. And unlike the rest of those guys, when there's this thing that happened in Europe called MiFID II, and it basically said that you can no longer exchange soft dollars for research, like if you're a broker dealer. So basically what was happening was broker dealers were paying for all these different services for their clients because they just wanted you to trade more. So they figured the more information you're consuming, then the more chances that you trade. And so, like, a lot of clients were getting these, you know, $40,000, $20,000 to $50,000 newsletters essentially for free, and the broker dealer was paying for it. And MiFID II was like, yep, can't do that anymore. And so the bottom fell out of a lot of these newsletters because no one was actually reading them, or no one wanted to, there wasn't a value add, right? That didn't really affect 13D from my understanding, because that wasn't their market, and they had a huge amount of value add. And part of it is that they're very, very readable. This was a thing that I had to argue with a lot of these guys, like talking to them, like you'd read some of those institutional newsletters and you really had to work hard to understand what the hell they were saying. And it's not just because my level of financial knowledge isn't up to par. It was like there was one guy who actually told me, like, we were taught to make it sound intellectual and complicated so that they would have to pick up the phone, right? So they would give them just enough understanding that they know something important is here, but then pick up the phone and pay me more to kind of consult. That's not the case with 13D. 13D stuff is extremely readable. It's very eloquent. It's wonderfully written. And it's a fantastic model. And they've built up this great business, taking a very, very different approach to the newsletter business and the research business. And I think this idea of kind of translating your skill set to a new market is one of those areas that's been underexplored within our industry. I think too many people have looked at the success of, like, kind of the Agora newsletter model and said, hey, we're going to do that. We're just going to do it less effectively than they did, without all of their the rest of that business kind of value chain. And that's really the wrong way, right? There's this whole thing. And Mark Ford, who I've interviewed on the FMS channel, and is one of the guys who helped, one of the marketing brains behind the growth of Agora. He's been a long time proponent of essentially swiping business models in content or offer models and things like that. Just basically look at what everybody else who's in the industry is doing, and copy that. And that's the best way to start in the business. And I think that's a great way to start in a lot of industries. I don't think that's the great way to build a unique, or not just unique, but to build a long-term sustainable business, right? Because you're just doing the same thing as everybody else. You're not adding any unique value. You're not going after a new market. You're not going after anything that has a differential to what everyone else is doing. And so then you end up competing on the exact same things, right? So like one of the problems is in kind of the newsletter side of the retail side of our business is copywriters, right? Everybody needs a copywriter to sell. And if you don't have a good copywriter, then it's really hard for you to scale. And then if you're a smaller guy, it's really hard to, like, there's not enough copywriters for the big companies really that are really good. Like there's very, very few. And so they're already struggling to find enough copywriters to produce the offers that they need to scale. And then if you're trying to compete with their budgets and their ability to drive commissions and things like that for a copywriter, it's really, really difficult for you to get a really truly A-level copywriter working for you. And there's a lot of great guys and gals who are writing copy who I would say are even though everyone calls themselves A-level, there's like maybe 5 guys who are A-level. Everyone, there's B level and there's C level and there's D level and there's like, what are you even doing level? But that copywriting function, because everyone's copying the same thing in terms of models, like we have a scarce resource of talent. And if you can't get that talent, then that entire marketing model gets really difficult for you to do. So that's another thing that's interesting about this to me, is that there is no, like, copy is not an issue here, right? It's a lot easier to get sales reps than it is to get copywriters. And corporate sales reps in particular, there are hundreds of thousands of them, if not more. I just wanted to give you this kind of overview of this very unique, different approach to the newsletter business to kind of get you thinking about what's your business, what's the way that you're doing things, and how could you do things differently. The 13D model, like I said, is fascinating in that sense. I always love the B2B side of the world. I think especially for smaller publishers, for smaller marketers, the B2B side of things tends to be an easier place to start. And you can see that all you guys who sell media, right, your B2B businesses, just the ability to sell, the ability to have higher value customers, those things are really, really valuable when you are a smaller shop. And so I think that the publishing and the trader education world, there's a lot of things that you do that could be translated into a different business that has or same business targeting a different market. And it's something to think about, like how you structure things. And then the other part of that is just to realize that quality of guru that you have is kind of is one of the limiting factors on the quality of client that you can get, right? And so I want to do a whole thing kind of taking some of the clips from some of the other conversations I've had with guys like Porter and Aaron DeHogue and others about how important that guru is, because it is the product. He is the product. And I think that piece of realizing that your guru, his credibility determines which customers you're capable of going after. And so if you have a lot of kind of like, or if you have no real thought put into who your guru is, or no real thought into building up the credibility of your guru, then you're just kind of have a natural limit on the people who are interested in who you, right? It's kind of like the more and more valuable the customer is, the less and less likely he likes your guru, right? Because the best customers we tend to have are like, when Porter was saying what they spent have like a $35,000 price point, and I've met a lot of his customers just out in the business world, And they're all people who are like, not all, but a lot of them are people from the finance industry. And so you'll find people who were RAs, you'll find people who have hedge funds, you'll find people who are, from all kinds of sides of the business who subscribe to his lifetime service, right? That $35,000 kind of thing, because of the quality of what they've put out, right? So there's a quality of content. And the success that Porter's had has put him into a place where, like, he is a little bit of a he's a guru to a lot of those finance guys. Making somebody a guru to that side of the business, like, you have we've seen this, like, oh, I had $100 million hedge fund, right? I had a client who was embarrassed. He told me he had $100 million hedge fund, and he was like, don't you dare put that in the copy. Because he'd come from the Morgan Stanley equities desk, and he was like, if I'm a $100 million hedge fund is an embarrassment. Okay, like, if you have a hedge fund and it's below like $1 billion, nobody takes you seriously. So please don't ever say, because he had just started it again and he was trying to raise capital, he was trying to decide kind of what he wanted to do. And so, like, even having $1 billion hedge fund, it's kind of like, just like, that's par for the course. Okay. That's really impressive to a retail trader. You're not going to impress most of the institutional world or even the corporate world. Oh, you had $1 billion and like, not super amazing. I even know guys who raised $1 billion for some groups like Bridgewater, and they're like, yeah, it's like, kind of like, that's not sales skill, that's Bridgewater's name at that point, right? It's easy to go in as a salesman for Bridgewater and raise $1 billion from people. And so anyway, I could keep rambling like I tend to do, but the big point here is, check out this model, understand the depth of the quality of the guru, and then think also about, like, the different markets that we're going to do. I'm going to do some stuff where we dive into the different segments of the existing markets in the newsletter world, for retail and trader education, and kind of start to talk about some other segments that are not being explored, and get a few people on here to kind of have that conversation. But for now, hope this is useful, or thought-provoking at least, and I'll talk to you later. Take care.